Good evening. Welcome. I'm Paul Zions, and I'm Dean of the College of Education at DePaul University. For the past 12 years, the College of Education, under the leadership of Diane Horowitz, has been presenting topical forums that addresses the significant issues of the day. Unfortunately, we have a large number of issues from which to choose each time. And tonight's topic clearly fits the bill, as I would argue that the importance of navigating the transition back to the classroom has never been more critical. Students who have been learning at home for the past 18 months have had to reacclimate to the world of school. The psychological and emotional needs that have to be addressed cannot be ignored. Those students who have been affected by the economy of their families are most affected. As a former teacher of students with severe emotional and behavior disorders, I can tell you that I worry that they will be disproportionately excluded from school this year. The vast majority of all of these students have simply not experienced the routine of school in 18 months, and they simply don't have the existing repertoire to call upon so they could easily succeed. We need to be patient and understanding. We need to have the empathy that we expect others to have with us. I am proud as Dean that we've been able to present these meetings each term to DePaul and the Chicagoland community. I am certain that Dr. Ockerman and tonight's panelists will provide to you insight and tools to help us cope with being back in school. Melissa Ockerman.
Thank you, Dean Zions. We greatly appreciate your continued support of these community building educational forums. I would also like to thank the organizers of this event, the indomitable Dr. Diane Horowitz, who's the coordinator of the education issues and forums, which occur every quarter. So keep your eye out for future events as well. And many, many thanks to our phenomenal staff, Aaron Rice, Alyssa Hepker, and Meredith Goya, all who have worked tirelessly to make this event possible. Thank you so much. I'm going to begin with a few opening remarks to set the stage for this evening's forum, and then I'm going to introduce our panelists. So as many of us came back to in-person learning this fall, armored with mask and vaccine mandates, we knew things would not simply go back to being normal. In fact, we had little idea of what a new normal could or should look like. Over the past year and a half, students have endured isolation, as well as exposure to adversity and traumatic events including things like unemployment of a family member, loss of housing, loss of learning, and loss of peer interaction and socialization. Many were experiencing the grief of losing a loved one. In fact, a new study estimates that nearly 114,000 children in the United States were orphaned during COVID-19. Although the impact of the pandemic will be a source of study for many years to come, research from the Office of Civil Rights has already shown us that for many students, the educational gaps that existed before the pandemic and access, opportunities, achievement, and outcomes are widening. And we know that these effects are falling disproportionately on students who went into the pandemic with the greatest educational needs and the fewest opportunities. Indeed, it has disproportionately hurt low-income students, students of color, students with special needs, students identifying as LGBTQ+, English language learners, and under-resourced school systems. As Dr. Dina Simmons, former Associate Director of Yale Center of Emotional Intelligence, stated, COVID-19 is our equity check. In heeding the call of our namesake, St. Vincent de Paul, we need to ask the question, what must be done? And as a society, we must do better. Tonight's illustrious panel of experts will help us to do just that. We are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Micere Keels, who is an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on understanding how race, ethnicity, and poverty structure the supports and challenges that children and youth experience. She is particularly invested in developing systems change interventions. Amazing. And she is also the founding director of the Trauma Responsive Educational Practices Project, which is a resource practice partnership that aims to connect the research on the science of trauma, with the realities of school and classroom management. And I'm just going to say that again, Trauma Responsive Educational Practices Project. It is a phenomenal resource, one that I would bookmark if I were y'all. So following Dr. Keels' remarks, you will hear from Lisette Flores. Ms. Flores is a professional school counselor for Chicago Public Schools. She currently works at an elementary school at Virgil Grissom on the far southeast side of Chicago. She's worked for the district for 8 years and is also a model counselor for the district. Ms. Flores was the previous co-chair for the CTU Counselors Committee and helped lead 2 huge contract wins for school counselors. She's also part of the CTU CPS Joint Committee that determines the schools who will receive one of the 120 positions during the life of this current contract. Following Ms. Flores' remarks, you will hear from Ms. Monique Smith. Ms. Smith is a Southside Chicago-bred educator with 10 years of experience working with underrepresented communities. She works at Piccolo Elementary School on the west side of Chicago. She focuses on systems and structures in low-income areas to provide education on how they directly impact student achievement. Ms. Smith is currently a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, helping schools build their capacity to do this important work. Prior to this, she was a 4th grade reading teacher. Such an incredible panel. So once Ms. Smith has completed her remarks, we will open up the conversation for questions from the audience. In the meantime, please feel free to put questions in the chat during their presentations, and we will collect them. As always, this is meant to be an engaging conversation, and we welcome your comments and questions. And again, we'll answer them during the last segment of our panel discussion this evening. So let's begin. Dr. Keels, we're honored to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I just noticed the shift in the extension of the days. I was like, wait, I'm not sure if I have enough light. I just noticed it going a little bit darker. So really, thank you. Thank you very much, Diane, for inviting me. Thank you to the audience for being here. It's always a little tough in these virtual presentations because although I know that many of you are here and listening, I can't actually see you. I don't get the benefit of your reactions and your faces to know whether or not something's landing and should it be described a little bit differently. So this is still a little tough to do, even though we've been doing it for this long. So I do want to say thank you for joining and participating in this conversation tonight. I'm really looking forward to my 2 co-presenters who are going to talk about how they are doing the work of making this happen in schools in this moment and managing all of the challenges. And as was noted in the introduction, one of the things that I do with my project is really think about how do we take the research and the science that we know and apply it and translate it in a way that can make it feasible for the realities of constraints and opportunities in schools and in classrooms. And so being able to do this with my 2 co-presenters who will follow, who are doing that work of making it happen in their schools and in their classrooms. So I want to just share my screen so I can share a few slides to help with this. And I'm turning on my timer to make sure that I also stay within time. Okay, so the title of the talk being Care and Safety in the Classroom. One thing right off for me when I think about this is that the COVID-19 and the pandemic and everything associated with it brought it to the forefront, the fact that we can't teach without also attending to whether students feel cared for and whether they feel safe, whether it feels to them, whether they're experiencing it as a safe learning environment, because that determines the extent to which their brains and their bodies are in a state that enables them to benefit from all of the rigorous instruction that happens in the classroom. You can't, COVID just made clear more than anything when we think about our schools and we think about the needs of our students, that we just can't separate the physiological regulation of students, their emotional safety, and all of the stresses in their lives from what's happening in school and the learning that's happening in the classroom. And so even though we should have been attending, all of us attending to care and safety in the classroom before the pandemic, we now have clear evidence that we need to in this moment, and hopefully it'll be something that really will continue as we go on. So one of the things I always like to do is to make sure that we are all working with the same definition of trauma. And one of those big things when we think about the definition of trauma is that it's not the event, it's not the pandemic, it's not the event itself. So it's not just the fact that many kids before COVID and now many more post-COVID are coping with sudden and unexpected loss of loved ones, difficulty grieving that loss, chaos that results from homelessness, financial stress, lack of safety in their neighborhoods. Those events are what we call potentially traumatic, which means the event is potentially traumatic, but the trauma itself, when we're thinking about psychological trauma, it's the wound that it leaves behind in the individual if they don't have the coping supports and resources to help them recover. So it's not the event, but it's the cognitive, psychological, and emotional wound that lingers after the traumatic event has passed. So that means then that there are things that we can do in order to heal those cognitive, psychological, and emotional wounds to ensure that individuals who experience potentially traumatic events are not left with lingering trauma. So in this moment, even though COVID has shifted everything, we really have to remember that trauma is not new. And what were kids coping with before trauma, and how is it distributed across our society? And so this is a really quick snapshot way. This was some 2016 data from the National Survey of Children's Health. And what these percentages represent are the percent of kids in various racial and ethnic groups that had no adverse childhood experiences. And we also know that adverse childhood experiences, as they're measured, don't list everything. There are lots of things that are not listed in that. But even if we just list the adverse childhood experiences, we see that there's very different distribution across racial and ethnic groups. And this was before COVID. And we also have clear evidence that the trauma created by COVID is not equally distributed, and it's much higher among racial and ethnic minority and low socioeconomic groups of families and children. And when we're thinking about these distributions and trying to understand why there's so large gaps and differences between racial and ethnic groups, we need to think about an expansive definition and understanding of trauma. And so these are the 6 different types of trauma. The first being historical trauma, which is that for some groups of individuals in the US, their history for many generations and hundreds of years is rooted in traumatic experiences. And one of the things that we know about trauma is when it's not healed in one generation, when that generation becomes adults and have children, that trauma is passed on to the next generation. And so there's some groups of Americans that from historical legacies that are passed on in their experiences, generational experiences, that there's a different likelihood of being exposed to trauma as kids. The other is that when we think about intergenerational trauma, we are thinking about how having experienced, having that history, having that legacy, having experiencing discrimination and stress, racial related stressors as an adult disrupts parenting, disrupts caregiving, and that those compromised family and community functioning and relationships affect kids. And then next we think about the ones below acute and chronic trauma. Those are the things that we traditionally think about, which are those things that happen in an individual's lifetime. So it could be car accident. It could be some other traumatic loss event, such as loss of a loved one from COVID-19. So we often think just about those acute trauma incidents that happen in an individual's lifetime, but we also have to think for some groups, they have a different level of exposure to historical and intergenerational trauma. And then also for some groups, trauma is not, doesn't result from one event that happens in an otherwise relatively stable life. For some groups of kids, they are living in contexts and environments where trauma is chronic. They're chronically exposed to distressing and disturbing and psychologically, emotionally, and physically harmful events. And they don't have the time to heal from one traumatic event before they experience the next traumatic event. So some children are chronically trying to negotiate and recover from traumatic events. And so the next one is complex trauma, which is often what we're dealing with in schools, which is that kids from an early age, if they are exposed to ongoing and chronic and repeated and multiple forms of traumatic events, it means that they're going to be missing core aspects of their psychological and emotional and behavioral development that should have happened. And so at school, as educators and social workers and other forms of professionals in the educational space, there's going to be a need to provide developmental input that will lead to positive development. There's going to need to do basic socialization that one may have expected that would have happened before kids come to school. And then for other kids who leave school and go home to an unsafe neighborhood or unsafe home, it's going to be important to essentially reteach a lot of those social and emotional skills each and every day when kids make that transition from home and community into the school context. And then lastly, what we have is system-induced trauma. And so that is, as it states, when systems designed to help trauma victims compound or re-traumatize through policies, procedures, and practices. And when we're thinking about the educational system, one of those ways is when kids who are exhibiting challenging behaviors at school because they are struggling to cope with traumatic experiences and events that are happening outside of school. And so they are then being punished because they're lacking or just don't have enough coping skills, or what they're experiencing is really more than any average individual should be expected and is able to cope with. And so these are all of the different forms of trauma. We really need to think more expansively when we're thinking about what it is that kids might be coping with that is underlying the challenging behaviors that we might be seeing at school. So that was before COVID. And then after COVID, it's just really, as was done in the introduction, reminding us that for some kids, these are new experiences. And for some kids, it's just intensified the extent to which they're experiencing these things. So there's individual and communal grief and loss, extreme hunger, neglect from caregivers who themselves are emotionally overwhelmed because they've lost maybe a spouse, they've lost a loved one, they've lost a job, and all of those other things really wear down a parent's ability to provide care. So kids themselves are experiencing emotional instability in themselves or the adults around them. I'm going to say a little bit here about the instability in the adults around them. The aspects of the confusion around should we wear masks or not masks, it's in schools. What are the expectations for vaccinations? What is truth from fiction, from myth around how COVID spreads? And all of those and many other factors one of the things that increased the level of dysregulation in kids this fall is just that is that noise, I would say, that they experience it as just these adults, voices of adults around them who are supposed to be providing care and support that are now in very conflictual situations. And so kids are really having trouble trying to parse all of those conflicting voices. And all that they know is that the adults around them are fighting with each other in new ways that they didn't know before, that they didn't see before. And then lastly on this list, increased fear and worry, lack of sense of safety, and feelings of powerlessness. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but again, it's just reminding us that if kids are coping with these things, it's going to be difficult for them to be regulated in their behaviors at school. And so we really need to push that search for understanding what is underlying, what is beneath the behaviors that we see. And one of the things, after kind of talking about all of that, that I really like to always do is remind us that we're not trying to create stress-free life for kids, because positive stress is good. Stress is actually one of the things that we create in schools. When we create learning challenges for students, that's stressful, but it's a positive stress when we don't just give them the answers to things. We ask them to attempt tasks and activities that are just above where they are in their current learning, because we want to push them to grow. That is experienced as stress, and it is a positive stressor. Stress becomes challenging when it falls into these other areas. So the next is when a stressor is tolerable. So it is the event and the experience is a more severe stressor, but it's limited in duration and time. And the individual, in this case, students, receive support for recovery. When we experience more intense stressors, but get support for recovery, then we can have something that's called post-traumatic growth. So that stressful event really pushed our coping resources, but because we were supported, instead of breaking down, we've gotten stronger and developed new coping resources. Toxic stress is when the stress is extreme, frequent, or extended in activation of the body's stress response. So we just keep causing the individual to have to pump those stress hormones. When you pump out stress hormones, it activates all of your systems. So your heart rate is going up, you're sweating, you are distressed cognitively. So when that's happening repeatedly, that stress becomes toxic. And a really important part of that, part of toxic stress is when these extreme, frequent, or extended stressors happen without the buffering presence of a supportive adult. And so it's reminding us that resilience is most likely to occur in the context of supportive developmental relationships. And educator-student relationships are exactly those, supportive developmental relationships. So as, again, was noted in the opening lead-up, we are in a particularly interesting context in general in this post-COVID moment. And in Chicago, we are in that context where kids were in either fully remote or hybrid learning for months upon months upon months. And in this return to school, we really need to shift our perspective to try to think about it from children's perspectives. And one of those ways that we need to think about it when we're trying to make sense of some of the acting out behaviors that we might be seeing in our classrooms is that the return to schooling is likely experienced by most kids as some form of loss of autonomy. So if you were in either hybrid and learning from home a couple of days a week, or if you were fully remote, you could go to the bathroom whenever you wanted to go to the bathroom. The rules around and procedures and being quite rigid in how we all need to either ask to go to the bathroom or line up to go to the bathroom, or there's a specific time we're going to go to the bathroom, and so you need to make it happen during that window when it's bathroom time. That's actually a really insignificant loss of autonomy that, you know, kids had in these months and months and months. They could pause their lesson, whatever they were doing. They could step away from the remote classroom, go to the bathroom, and come back. And so in the return to school, that is just one small example of what might be experienced as a loss of autonomy. Many kids who were at home, they could lay on their backs, they could walk around with their iPad, you know, they could sit and put their feet up in the air as they were doing any lessons on their computer at home. So there's also this other aspect of, we know we have lots of kids in our classes that we're sitting straight up and down, facing forward. It's just not the most natural and comfortable position for their body, and actually contorting themselves into different positions is what feels most comfortable and relaxing, and then allows them to focus on what they're doing. So again, in the return to in-person learning, they've lost some of that freedom in just being able to let their body do what feels good in that moment. For older kids, there's the aspect of, especially if they were doing their learning asynchronously, they could get up at a later time in the morning and then log on to that asynchronous lesson at whatever time, do that concentrated learning, bit of learning, and then log off. We're going to need to do a lot of work to build that stamina for sitting still and focusing and all of those things. And it's on and on and on, but just really being able to remember and think that there's a loss of autonomy that kids are experiencing in this return to the classroom. And it doesn't have to be a full loss of autonomy. What we suggest is this idea of kind of maximum bounded choice, which means giving kids an A or a B, where both A and B are equally acceptable to you. When you're giving most assignments, most in-class lessons, homework, switching from one activity to another. And it's a way for you to create and give agency, but within the confines of where whichever choice they pick, they're equally okay to you. So you've already structured the context and structured the options, and then enable them to pick whichever one they choose. That it's really one of those easy and just kind of fundamental and just a way to get into routinely doing it that gives the students a huge sense and feeling of autonomy. And it makes it that there's so much less that they have to push back against because they've chosen whether they want A or B. And so even though you might be doing it in order as the classroom, you know, to manage behavior in the classroom, the students actually experience it as being given freedom in the classroom. So there's really simple ways that when we understand and recognize quite clearly that from the student's perspective, being back in the classroom is a loss of some of the things that they enjoy. There are many wonderful things that they experience about being back in the classroom. Loss of autonomy is not one of them. And we don't have to make that a challenge. We can plan for this. So I just want to make this note here that adult self-regulation is everything. We kind of knew that before the pandemic, but we are in a context where all of us went through a pandemic, adults, kids, educators, non-educators. And so all of us are struggling to manage dysregulation. And if the adult is dysregulated and the student is dysregulated, there's almost no hope for having a positive classroom climate. And when kids get dysregulated, if the adult is dysregulated, it feeds on that and escalates pretty quickly, as I'm sure most of us know and have seen. And so when we say adult self-regulation is everything, for us, that's really key between being a reactive educator. And so we define a reactive educator as when their actions are determined by emotions that were triggered by students' behavior. When we are reactive, our reaction to the behavior is often much more intense and punitive than is warranted by the situation, versus being responsive. And being responsive is when educators' actions engage their knowledge about trauma in ways that enable them to separate their triggered emotions from the developmentally supportive response that they display to students. So it is absolutely okay and even necessary to recognize that I am really angry, or that was, in my perception, experienced that as disrespectful, or what that student said or did hurt my feelings. It's important to recognize that there was an emotional response, and then being able to give yourself a 1 to 3 breath pause. Even just a 1 breath, 1 second pause can slow down our reaction so that we are more responsive. And so when we can pause, we can focus then on utilizing our pedagogical practices that help students build their coping and self-regulation skills. So that pause is all about, okay, there was a reaction there. What can be my response that is going to teach this student a better way to respond next time? And when we can do that again and again and again, students' behaviors change. And then I'm just going to end by having this graphic up here. So which is what work on with the project, track project, is really thinking about what are all of the components in the school that need to come together in order for a school to be holistically supportive of kids coping with trauma and kids exhibiting dysregulation. And as you can see with that green box around everything, prevention and management of secondary traumatic stress of educators is key. It's everything. Everything sits inside that box. The next on the bottom is really mindfulness for all. And that's really about just bringing down the dysregulation a little bit so that we can then focus on improving the physical safety, that there's no actual fights and threats, unsafe spaces in the school. Psychological safety is a discipline that we do to ensure that it's not identity damaging. There's emotional safety, strong relationships, and at the top, it's integrating social emotional learning into core curriculum and instruction. So we're all kind of on this journey and on this train of moving SEL away from discrete lessons that happen during selected and identified times of the day to something where we're constantly trying to teach those core social emotional skills as we teach and integrating it into our lesson plans as we teach our core courses. Because there's just recognizing that it's something that needs to happen all day long, that continual teaching and socialization of the well-being and behavior management pieces of being in a learning environment, which is an interpersonal environment. And so with that, and I feel like, let's see. Oops. It's taking away my controls, so I'm not sure if you can still see or hear me, because it's not letting me get back to my Zoom controls. Oh, there we go. Somebody else took it over. Good. So now I will turn it over to Lisette Flores, and I'll also turn my lights on.
Thank you, Dr. Keels. Hi, everyone. So my name is Lisette Flores. I am a elementary school counselor for Chicago Public Schools. I'm currently working at Grissom Elementary, that's on the far southeast side of the city. Just a little bit about my school. So my school is located in Hegewisch. It's a pretty diverse neighborhood, pretty well established. Just some demographics for my students. We're about 69% low income, and the majority of our students are Hispanic, followed by Caucasian, then African American, and we do have a very small population of Middle Eastern. So some of the things that we've noticed, so Dr. Steele, you mentioned a lot about trauma, about the loss of autonomy. These are all things that we've noticed coming back into the building. I know myself and other counselors from the district have noticed just a lot of students who've been presenting with a lot of symptoms of anxiety, social anxiety, school anxiety, especially our little ones who are experiencing being in a school building for the first time. Thinking back to our second graders, they were in kindergarten. They were in the middle of kindergarten when this pandemic started. So they've only experienced, half a year of what it's like to be in the school, where our kindergarten and first graders and pre-K babies have never been in the school setting. A lot of students having just a lot of social anxiety, not really wanting to participate, feeling very awkward with their friends, not really knowing how do they fit in. A lot of just body image concerns, self-esteem. They look very different coming back. It's been a year and a half, and they just are feeling just very insecure with themselves. I know what I've done. We have a lot of students, because of their anxiety, and just the loss of autonomy, they tend to kind of like squirm around. So I've given out a lot of fidget toys, and I actually created calm corners with a calming toolbox for the classroom, so that students have an opportunity to take a break if they need it while they're in the classroom. Other things that counselors and I have seen, just a lot of students experience loss. So loss of caregivers, loss of, close or extended family. They're still grieving. A lot of staff and adults in the building too. This was it was a collective trauma. So we are seeing just a lot of students who are still grieving. There's just a lot of triggers, like every day, anniversaries, birthdays come up, and it just tends to be, just another reminder of the absence that they have in their life. So being able to provide students with opportunities, to take a break, to go and meet with the counselor, to journal. And these are all things that we're trying to provide. We've also experienced a lot of higher volumes of just incidents with behaviors. Again, this probably has to do with the loss of autonomy, where we need to reteach students a lot of the SEL skills for conflict resolution. So we're seeing a lot more physical fights, a lot of more verbal conflicts among peers, and this stems, kindergarten all the way through 8th grade in my building. We have students who are also having a really hard time, maintaining boundaries. So whether it's a physical boundary or, emotional boundaries, just because they haven't been around their peers or around a lot of other people for a while. A lot of students who are presenting with symptoms of depression, just very low mood, uninterested, disengaged from learning. We see this particularly in middle school. So district-wide, we saw that a lot of our, in high school and in middle school, a lot of students kind of became very disengaged with remote learning for many reasons. Remote learning wasn't for everyone. And then you also had students who dealt with, loss of, just family stressors, loss of income, loss of jobs, just a lot of changes, having to deal with a lot of the unknowns of the pandemic. And now they're having just a really hard time kind of adapting to being back in school, feeling kind of lost with not knowing, the expectation that they have to know something, but because they had a lot of learning loss from the previous year, they're falling behind, and which then again creates a lot of anxiety as well, because they feel lost in the classroom. And then we also have, I know something that I've noticed is with students who already had experienced or students who already had experienced trauma, loss previous to COVID, a lot of their symptoms are, they intensified. This was happening during the pandemic, and then now in school, it's happening. And I know this particularly for students who are grieving. I know there's just a lot of anxiety and fear and worry that they bring to school every day. So just some things that our school counselors, myself in the building have been doing. The number one thing is really trying to ensure that our school is a safe space and a safe, welcoming place. So we did a lot of community building. So starting from the beginning of the school, making sure that the classrooms were really focusing on community building, building strong relationships, just to establish safety for our students. So we do SEL, so making sure that, you know, SEL is done across the board, making sure that we have, you know, in some schools, it's like you may only have one counselor. I'm the only counselor in my school, but I make myself available to my students. I've been doing a lot of small group, one-on-one, or going into the classrooms to help the teachers with just SEL lessons, really focusing on the culture and climate of my building, focusing on you know, the systems that we have in place, making sure that we're setting the expectations that we're teaching and reteaching things, just so there can be some structure and routine in our building, which is what was lost during the pandemic. Let me see what else. Partnering with a lot of outside school partners. So bringing back a lot of the organizations that we used to work with, really working with families to connect them with resources outside of school. So these are just some of the things that we're doing, myself and other counselors, just making sure that we're prioritizing SEL, prioritizing, ensuring that relationships are the forefront of our schools, building safety, having systems in place that help support a lot of collaboration, you know, with our colleagues as well as with our community partners, and working with families to make sure that we're able to provide any need that they have. So that's just a little bit of kind of like what we've been doing. We have a lot of, there's still a lot of need, a lot of things that we know that right now, especially like where I am at, where I'm located, I don't have a lot of community partners that I'm able to kind of work with. So we have to get creative and just kind of network. And that's kind of where the CTO Counselors Committee comes into play. So I've been the co-chair for the last 3 years. And as a committee, we've done a lot of things to really advocate for the role of counselors and also the need of school counselors and other clinicians in the buildings. So I have, and especially as elementary school counselors, most elementary school counselors are only one in the building. And as we know in CPS, our social workers are not in every school every day of the week. You know, there are some schools that are fortunate enough to already have a school social worker every day, but most schools are not there yet. Therefore, the job can get kind of lonely. It can become very overwhelming. So it's nice to have a good network. And the CTO Counselors Committee provides a network for counselors to help brainstorm, solve problems. If there are things that are happening district-wide, we kind of, make sure that we advocate for our role so that all students have access to a counselor. Some of our big contract wins. So previously in CPS, school counselors were misused. And for many years, they were used as case managers, which kind of handled all of the special education, students, paperwork, meetings, compliance. In 2016, we were able to win language, which allowed counselors to refuse the role of a case manager, which was really huge. And that allowed a lot of school counselors to step away from case management and be a school counselor so that their students would have access. In the last strike in 2019, we won really great language that protects our role, where principals assign duties that align with the REACH, which needs to align with the American School Counseling Association recommended duties, which again also allows students to have access to counselors. And I think this is extremely important right now, coming back and still going through the pandemic, where students are able to access their school counselor and any other clinician that they may have in the building. So those are just a couple of the things that we were able to win. The 120 equity positions, which can be to help improve social emotional learning. So that can be staffing, a restorative justice coordinator, a school counselor, a librarian, or anything that would support social emotional learning in the school building. So that's pretty much my presentation, just a little bit of what we've been seeing in the school building since the students have come back. And I will pass it on to you, Ms. Smith.
Hey, everybody. My name is Monique Smith. I'm currently a DEI coach for CPS. It's so crazy not being able to see you guys' face, but I'm gonna just assume that everybody is smiling and digging into this material. I wanted to say thank you to Dr. Keels and Ms. Flores for setting us up in their insightful words. I know that we're talking specifically about COVID, but as Dr. Keel said before, it's important for us to acknowledge that a lot of the issues that we're discussing or even trying to accommodate with social emotional learning have superseded the pandemic, and they're actually just being exacerbated by all of the things that are going on, specifically in our low income neighborhoods here in CPS on our south and west sides. So some of those things that I'm thinking of off top are like access to technology. So when our students had to go home for the pandemic, and even now, if there happens to be an outbreak, certain low income neighborhoods don't have that access to technology, as well as having Wi-Fi access at home to be able to do the work if they're not in the school building. We also have things like overcrowded classrooms, which have been an issue before COVID, but again, are now more dangerous because of the health issues and what communities are still unvaccinated. So pre-COVID, we had a mandate of no more than 15 students in a space. And just a few months later, and although the pandemic is not over, we're back to seeing some of those larger classrooms. So we have some classrooms that are 30 students to one teacher, and some that may even reach up to 40. So not only giving us issues with like academics, but also the health impact that has. And then one of the things that was really salient over the pandemic is that because teachers were not in person with their students, you had older students having to help out their younger brothers and sisters or family members that were in the home. So having those household things kind of take priority over their own learning, and having to kind of like manage the household also led to like learning loss. So it's important to like note those things, because while they existed before the pandemic, we're at like a different stage where we're having to make some systems and structures to support the gaps that they created. So as I mentioned before, my particular role is a diversity, equity, and inclusion coach. And that's kind of like a new buzzword in education. And I wanted to kind of frame what that means and what my work does and how that can support you in your individual spaces. So I actually started off in the classroom, as mentioned before. I was a primary reading teacher for 8 years. And then while I was in the classroom and kind of serving in different teacher roles, I started to notice that the systems and structures that different organizations and schools had, they had as much to do with student achievement as like the individual interventions that I was giving to students. And so that helped me kind of pivot into this current role, which is my goal is to help adults seek understanding the way that their race, their culture, their gender, or their social and economic status create privilege in their individual identities and how that impacts how they show up in the workplace. So again, teachers looking at individual in their individual actions and thinking about how that impacts the students that they serve. The school that I work at currently is Piccolo School of Excellence. It's a school, we're on the west side of Chicago in Humboldt Park. My school is very unique, which I love because it is split 50-50. So we have 50% Black students and 50% Latinx students. And currently over 96% of our students receive free or reduced lunch. So just in context, when we think about diversity, diversity means the diversity of like the current situation. So for me in underrepresented communities, that means that I focus specifically on race, class, and gender. And although there are other, diversity factors for this given situation, those are the ones that are prioritized. When I think about equity, it is answering the question, who's not included? And then thinking intentionally about what systems, structures, and teacher practices need to be evident to make sure that all students receive an equitable education experience. And then the inclusion comes from creating a warm and safe environment. And when I say warm and safe from a teacher's perspective, it means safe so that teachers can live out their values, they can share ideas, and they can also express dissent, because we want that pushback that creates a healthy environment. So all of those things kind of help create where you can approach social emotional learning or trauma, mental illness, all of those things in your own practices or in your schools or organizations that you're a part of. I typically focus on the teacher action because, again, as mentioned, like Dr. Keels before, when we have mindfulness of all, and specifically mindfulness of us as adults and the moves that we make, it impacts our entire environment, and it impacts the way that students get to show up as themselves in this environment. So when we're mindful, it has great benefits. So some of the things that I like to do is kind of like a half and half, a checks and balances. There are school-wide structures and things that need to be present, and then there's also individual teacher moves that need to be present. I know that this is not surprising, but from a school-wide standpoint, one of the things that is really important is to have some type of like diversity, equity, and inclusion vision or a culture mission that your school is committing to. And this is important because race and class must be central to our analysis to the root causes and consequences of educational inequity. So when we're thinking about social emotional learning, when we're thinking about the things that we want to alleviate in students' experiences so that they can have academic achievements, we have to ground that in what systems have gotten us here, those root causes. And race and class are typically at the root cause. We have to be able to solve systemic problems through thinking, reflection, learning, and then acting also systemically. So from a school-wide level, you have to have someone who has like a big picture of how the community supports, how the school system structures all either support or not support this overall culture vision that your school ultimately has. And then most importantly, we want to be able to challenge bias. We want to create a comfortable and warm space where we can self-audit, where we can challenge things that we see so that we're creating warm and safe environments for all of the students involved. And then from a teacher standpoint, Ms. Flores mentioned a lot of specific teacher moves that we see happen, like creating a safe space, community building, focusing on strong relationships, having SEL like as a specific like curriculum, and small groups. All of those are great teacher moves that you should be using in the space that help like center social emotional learning. But from a teacher standpoint, one of the things that I want to emphasize is along with like a culture mission or a diversity and equity and inclusion vision, you want to have a teacher self-audit. You want to have some type of practice as a practitioner, because that's what we are as professionals, where you are journaling or auditing yourself in your practice, and you have your own social emotional plan. So the same way that we have like second step or a curriculum for students, you want to make sure that you have an equal practice for yourself, so that when we're showing up in front of students, we have this mindfulness taken care of. We also want to make sure that we are centering student voice. So in having a social and an emotional learning curriculum, you want to make sure that it is centering the culture of the students that it is meant to represent, and that it is centering their identity so that they can feel most comfortable and see themselves reflected in that curriculum. We want to make sure that also your social and emotional learning curriculum or priorities center our parents and our stakeholders, because including the community in the work that we do is important, because parents know what's best and they know what's best for their students. And so when we include their voices into the conversation, not only are we building community collaborators, we're also taking the people who know students the best, their parents, their families, and we're incorporating that in our lessons and in our messages, in the vision for the school or organizations that we work for. And then like, finally, we're breaking that bias. Having, it goes without saying that even without us trying, we all have bias. And so by doing those like teacher reflections and having these different checks and balances, we're able to like hold ourselves accountable to make sure that that is not showing up in our teacher practices and that students get an equitable education. So again, that's like kind of like twofold. Again, you want to have something where you have a school-wide system of support that has this long-term goal, but then you want to make sure that you also have an individual teacher and professional practice that holds yourself accountable. If you do that, your systems, your school-wide systems, your individual, as well with your teacher practice, like Ms. Flores mentioned, all of those things together will create a cohesive social and emotional learning platform for students to be able to be successful. I think next we're going to jump into some questions and answers. So I'm going to pass it on over.
Okay, super. Thank you so much. It is now time for our Q&A part of the event. And so all of our speakers can come back on, and please feel free to put your questions in the chat section, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. So again, phenomenal. I was taking copious notes, as I'm sure many others were. So we have a question here that says, Dr. Keels mentioned the importance of incorporating SEL into the content areas. We have many veteran teachers who are very focused on getting through their content and accelerating the curriculum to catch up where they need to be putting, and then they put SEL aside. So how can we get teachers to buy into this?
So one important piece of that is that we can accelerate our curriculum, and us as the adults can get through the curriculum, but it doesn't mean that the kids are actually taking it in, processing it in a way that will enable them to learn and remember it in order to be able to demonstrate comprehension later on any kind of assessment. So as well as just learning the information, to just learn the information itself. So yeah, adults can speed up and get through our curriculum, but it doesn't mean that, and even if we think we're teaching it rigorously, again, if the student is in distress or zoned out or any other emotional state than one where they are like energized and engaged and focused on the learning, there's going to be a huge disconnect between us getting through the content and any of it being learned, and that is then represented on any assessments. So that is really kind of what we talk to teachers about when we're trying to get them to slow down and make space for those emotional aspects, as well as thinking about, well, are my students actually engaged? So it's really this aspect of how much are you paying attention to those learners that are in front of you in the classroom? So that's the kind of.
Yeah, that's great messaging, helping them understand that even if you're speeding up, your students may not be receptive. So ensuring that you have attended to those social emotional needs first. Any other comments from our panelists around that question?
I can add something. So I know something that the network where I work, this is the second year that we've done it. We have SEL themes. So each month we have a theme, and those themes are connected to just like different activities, but they also have a book. So it's like a book of the month. And that allows like the teachers to be able to incorporate that SEL book, which is also diverse, like it's a culturally diverse book where students are able to see themselves, as mirrors, and it teaches different SEL skills. So for example, the first theme that we've worked on was community building. So then we have a book per cluster. So we have like a 6th through 8th grade book, usually a novel. Then we have a 3rd through 5th, and then a K through 2nd. And that's been a way where, especially up in the middle school, where because they're all teaching this to their homeroom, then they can reinforce this throughout the day, throughout their lessons, like later on. So that's kind of a way that we've been able to kind of integrate SEL into more interdisciplinary, like into other subjects. And then it's done school-wide, which helps. And then it's also done network-wide. So.
Hey, creative ideas there. Monique, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think also just showing and modeling like specifically the benefits and like what that looks like to incorporate social emotional learning into the lesson would be great, because it may be things that teachers are already doing, but like not even noticing. I think about like the skill of like resiliency and like honoring those soft skills. If I'm in the middle of a math lesson and a student tries really hard, that's a learning opportunity right there for me to name that skill. Hey, I noticed X, Y, and Z really show resiliency. What does that look like? And kind of having that conversation in the middle of the lesson is a way that we can like ground it in those social emotional skills. So even if there's not a 30-minute segment of this 1 hour lesson, there are pivots that can happen throughout the lesson that kind of ground us in those soft skills and show that they're as equally as important as like the academic content that we're covering.
Excellent. Great. This is great responses. Thank you so much. We have a question. Can you give some sample activities that have helped your students, perhaps small group SEL activities?
So I know one thing that I'm really big on relationship building. And I think that I feel like that's like the foundation to students feeling safe, right? So we know that we've just experienced this collective trauma. A lot of students have already experienced previous trauma, as the ACEs lets us know. And safety is kind of the forefront, like, unless students feel safe, they can't progress in, other things. So talking circles are a great way of building community within the classroom, having the teacher and students create their classroom norms, where students feel that they're a part of, what are the things that I need in this classroom so that I can feel safe. And then they can hold each other accountable. And then just building community where you start off very like surface level, kind of getting to know each other, getting to know themselves. And then it becomes where students start to feel, once they start to feel more comfortable, they start to feel safe. Then they start to get, a little bit deeper. So then they can start to problem solve. If there are issues happening in the classroom, it can be addressed in a talking circle. So talking circles are really great to kind of help build community and help build rapport. with among the students, among themselves, as well as with their teacher.
Great restorative practice. Thank you for bringing that to light. Any other that you'd like to share?
I love morning meeting. I think at every age, it is just a way to ground and start off the day. And it can look different at different age ranges. You can like set up a structure where each day, like Monday can be a team builder. Tuesday, you can view what's going on in the community. Wednesday, you can have a discussion question. And that kind of helps to build that like community and environment throughout the week. And then one of the things I would like to name too is like we always have something going on culture wise each month. So creating themes that are grounded in culture. We just finished up Hispanic Heritage Month. So having like activities planned around those different topics will also help to build relationship and like inviting community members in or families. Are also like great opportunities to practice social emotional learning in your room. Oops, sorry. That's my timer.
No problem. We've all been there. And so actually, let's see. Building off of what you're stating, Monique, they're also wondering so you mentioned getting parents involved in the learning process so that those skills can be practiced at home, and that parents, caregivers know students best. Can some of you, any of you, talk about how you can best involve parents and caregivers into the SEL process?
So one little thing that I can say that I try to get teachers and educators to think about this, and this is really critically important for classroom teachers, is around the parent engagement piece, is this aspect of how ensuring that your first communication with parents is not about a problem or not about an issue that you think is wrong. It's not, your first communication is not sharing some kind of negative news. And really, I when we work with schools, try to make this a rule, which is saying, if something has happened with a student and it is a challenge and you need to reach out to home and work with parents, and you have not yet contacted them, you have to hold it. You have to hold it for at least a week. And you have to contact them now, but you're going to contact them and share something positive and contact them and try to build some kind of a working relationship that's starting with something that you saw that the student did, or do you want to share it, that is great, or just reaching out to make connection, making that note that we really, I really want to collaborate with you this year and collaborate with all my parents, work with their students. Like, you have to hold it. And then you can come later with the engaging in a very collaborative way to say, I've seen this has happened. I'd really like to talk with you about how we can work together. I really want to learn from what works at home and or anything else. But so those two things, which is one, absolutely not that your first contact with the parent is communicating some kind of negative news. And two, when you do reach out, that it is in that clear spirit of how can we work together to support your child. And also, as much as possible, using that language of, wanting to learn from you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Other thoughts about the parental involvement? A really wonderful message about ensuring that first point of contact is going to be relationship building, not creating some hostility or antagonistic relationships with the school, but really thinking about how we build that community with our parents and our caregivers. Other ideas that you have done with parents and caregivers in your schools?
So I know we have newsletters that we have monthly newsletters, and usually our monthly newsletters also include the SEL themes. You know, I haven't done it this year just because it's just been so busy. But last year during the pandemic, I had a SEL newsletter, and I would include tips for parents of ways that they could reinforce whatever SEL skill we were working on that month. But I know our current newsletter does include, you know, what the SEL theme for that month is and things of that sort.
Yeah, and if you all want to see an exemplary Counselor's Corner website, you can look at Grissom's website. Lissette has done a phenomenal job of including resources. I highly recommend you take a look at that as well. Anything else, Ms. Smith?
Yeah, I would just add, just ask. Create some type of system where you are letting the parents like inform what it is that they want to see in the school, what their availability is, how they can show up, and then your school kind of structuring it from there. So we send one out at the end of the year to inform our practice over the summer, and then we like to send one out at the top of each quarter, and then that way you can design school-wide structures, and then also like classroom things, like what you have the capacity to do by yourself. So I always just like to ask parents and like let them lead the way.
Yes, that is so good. That is so good. And it highlights some of the projects that students are doing now. So thank you. That's fantastic. So we're covering a lot of stakeholders. So they're asking about how we can get school administration to buy in to this as well. Any ideas about how to get administrators on board with SEL and prioritizing SEL?
So I love to use data
Mm-hmm.
to back up anything. So whenever, and I get it, sometimes we work with administrators who, you know, for whatever reason, are very instruction focused, where it's like, no, we can't, you know, jeopardize our instruction. But I think bringing in data research about how students can't access instruction unless their SEL needs are being met. So like Dr. Niels mentioned, like if you have a student who has experienced trauma, and the part of the brain that is engaged when they're, you know, because right now everything's a threat with COVID, they're not using their, you know, their executive functioning, that their logical brain, rational brain is not being utilized. So it's like they're not going to learn anything unless you're able to calm them. And that's where mindfulness comes in, and, you know, relaxation, to be able to bring them back down in order for them to then be ready to learn. So I love using data, research to really advocate for, you know, the need to prioritize SEL. I know in Chicago Public Schools currently, they are pushing the initiative where we're trying to heal and restore. And there's a big district-wide push for SEL, which is another thing that we can also use to kind of advocate for the need. But I always love to use data. And then also like my own internal data of, you know, I've met the X amount of students, and when before they were feeling this way, and then after they spoke with me, they were feeling better. And then, you know, that's data too. Just so a lot of data, conversations.
Yeah, fantastic. We often say data is the language of administrators, so we need to learn how to speak it. Absolutely, absolutely. Other thoughts in relation to administrators?
I think I would add, like, don't be afraid to be a change maker. Like, don't be afraid to be a disruptor. I think I'm always like, the fire next time. It doesn't have to always get there, but even without like a leadership position and being a classroom teacher or whatever position you hold, like, don't be afraid to also start an initiative and then allow it to like pick up steam, especially one that's important as this, and you know the impacts of it. I've always been blessed to have administrators who have bought into that thought, but if you find yourself at a space or in a school that doesn't, don't be afraid to start it with what you have, what's in your locus of control, and then watch it spread from there.
That is so inspiring. Thank you.
And really quickly, just to add to that, like in the building, you will find colleagues who have the same focus. So gathering them, because I know that's what we did in my school. So in my current school, when I started, we did not have a culture and climate leadership team. So there was a lot of, not a lot of structure in place. And I was like, we need this. And I found colleagues who are like, yes, we need this. I was like, all right, let's get together. And now we have the climate and culture team that meets to create these systems that need to be in place school-wide, you know, to kind of be the foundation to everything else. So
yes, right. That's right. Find your allies in the building, build some coalitions. Fantastic advice.
and then also allies in the union for us. It's like, so it goes beyond our school, like in our network, at the district level, and then at the union level too.
Yes, yes. Did you want to say anything else? Because it is really remarkable how far you all have come in the work of the union, specifically around school counseling, defining that role and ensuring that mental health is prioritized. You say anything else about how you all accomplished that and where you're headed next?
Yeah, just a lot of, so we have a really good group of counselors that have been on the committee. I believe Lisa De Gregorio started it.
Yes,
I know that she was one of, so she was the one who founded the committee, but, you know, just meeting, really focusing on we've been very strategic about what we've asked. So in the last 2 contracts, we've always asked for the same thing. So a job description that aligns, you know, our work, because oftentimes counselors were, you know, misused, mismanaged. And then the other big thing has been our ratio, because I know right now we still have school counselors who may have a ratio of, you know, 1,500 to 1, which is unheard of. So just really, and again, data. So using a lot of the data, like these are the initiatives that the district is, you know, trying to do. This is how counselors can help make that happen, and providing, you know, just the data that we have, research articles. So in our last bargaining, when we were covering the counseling article, myself and 2 of my counseling colleagues just presented a lot of the data to CPS, their own data, our own data, to really, you know, provide evidence of why it was so important to utilize counselors in, you know, the role that they're meant for and what they're trained for. And, you know, this is a master's level professional who has this expertise, not just in social emotional, but also with academic and then the career and, you know, college and post-secondary. And this is why it's so important to be able to, for students to have access to their counselor. So we were able to do that through just a lot of data, a lot of meetings, late night meetings, and just presenting data and presenting a lot of like the inequity, like looking at schools, looking at the South and West sides and what their access was to their counselors. And we're still pushing forward. So.
All right. Thank you for being our champions. That's
a lot of advocacy.
Yes, yes, indeed. Good. That's fantastic to see it in action. We have a question here about, with the increased demand for trauma-informed teaching, how are institutions caring for their teachers?
Yes, that is huge. And really it's a lot of what the schools and the school districts that we're working with right now. That's really a lot of what we're doing, is definitely with all of them in the first couple of weeks to the start of the academic year. That's what we were pushing when we were talking to administrators and district officials, asking them what their plan was if they didn't have one, reminding them that they needed to have a plan, wanting that to be a big part of the 1 or 2 weeks that they had before students came into the building and things like that. But really it is, and what we're really emphasizing with that is collective care. So, which is the idea that, you know, we're all in the same system together, that individuals in any given school, they are all in that together collectively. They can help each other cope with stress, but also collectively, they can get together and really break down and disaggregate their context. Like, what are the stresses in this context? what are the things that makes it just really highlighting those like top things that make it so hard for us to get through the day or get through the week with our well-being intact, and then collectively problem solving and working on how can we actually attack some of those stressors. So it's not just the self-care in the terms of coping with the stressors, but also like we know our building, we know what's happening with working together. We are the ones who actually have some a bit of leverage to be able to manage the stressors and not just be in this context of just coping with our reaction to the stressors. So those are a couple aspects of it. The other that I just try to say to educators right now is that the best kind of advice that I can give when we're thinking about the self-care side of it is that it is not something that you want to let build up and then try to respond to once your stress levels are really intense and over the top, and trying to get people to think about putting little, using the routines of the school day to put reminders to themselves, kind of like where you can use the school bell. Every time the bell goes, that's an indicator for you to just pause wherever you are, whatever you're doing, and just do a few seconds of deep breathing, self-check. How am I doing? And if you can, oftentimes in that moment, turn your back to whatever else, everything's going on around you, and just center yourself and try to release and reflect and release any negative emotions or stressors that may have happened that far in the day, your first couple of hours. And then when the next bell comes, you get a chance to do it again. And it's just this aspect of doing it repeatedly throughout the day and having it become automatic so that the stress doesn't build up over the course of the day. And then you get to the end of the day and you're just like, why do I feel so awful? Or get to the end of the week and you're just like, the weekend comes and all you can do is sleep because you're just so worn out.
Yeah.
That would be like my biggest thing in terms of everything else is important, but also that we're not letting it build up to that place where it becomes a toxic stressor.
That is such great advice around integration versus an add-on. Because I do think so many times it's like, okay, there's no way I'm going to go to the gym. I'm too tired. So it's like one more thing versus integrating it into your day and really making it part of your routine and your life. I love that suggestion. Do you all have others that you'd like to share?
I know, like for me, and I know other teachers also in my building, they use their lunch, making sure that they take a lunch.
Yes.
And sometimes like if they need to, getting out and leaving for lunch, or even going for a walk during their lunch. So they'll eat and then they'll walk around. We have a track. So they do that. I know at my previous school, when I also worked in West Humboldt Park at Cameron, I would go out to lunch every single day to make sure that I at least had those 45 minutes to kind of just be like, okay, so then I can get back to work. I think just a lot of like self-reflection and self-awareness. Self-awareness is huge, especially when we think about just being, being trauma informed and trauma responsive, is that when you're starting to notice that you're starting to feel a certain way, kind of stepping back and be like, all right, and recognizing those feelings like, okay, why, what's making me feel like this? Where could this be stemming from? And just always having self-awareness, which is a skill that we are teaching our students, to build self-awareness and recognize their own feelings and emotions. But those are like, for me, like, I know what I do with I make time to work out at least 3 times a day, 3 times a day, 3 times a week.
Like, whoa, that is
I wish.
Yeah.
I wish. No, at least like three times a week. So I do go and I work out if whether it's the gym or with a trainer, just because we know that being physical also helps build up, the endorphins that make us feel good and make us feel better. Journaling practicing mindfulness and even like gratitude. I think that's a big one. We often tend to focus on a lot of the bad things that are happening, and we minimize all the good things that are happening. So just being a little more mindful and practicing gratitude. So those are some of the things I know that helped me kind of get through the day.
Ms. Smith, anything you would like to add here at the end?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing all of those things. I think like at a school-wide level, a lot of schools are making changes as we come out of COVID. I don't see these things living like with fidelity maybe until like next year, but those systems are definitely getting built now. And I think now is the time to also like make voice care and concern, because as people are building those structures, it's coming from the ground up. So they're going to need all of the suggestions like possible. But just to echo those, I'm like I love morning routines. I think that having a solid morning routine before you face the day, before you face other people, is like very beneficial to not only your professional life, but your personal life. And then also just building some of these structures into your classroom or your space. So like when I was still in the classroom, we actually had like meditation. So even if I missed my meditation for somehow in my morning work, in my morning routine, I still was doing it with my students. And so it was actually an opportunity for me to be centered as well. So modeling, teaching those practices, but also like getting a little bit for ourselves, because we're also human and we can also benefit from those.
Yes, win-win. Well, to talk about wins here, self-awareness and gratitude, we just want to say thank you to our phenomenal speakers. We all learned just so much from you, and we are deeply grateful for your commitment to our students. You're really shining examples of change makers and the difference we all can make. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who attended tonight's events and the organizers. Take care and be well.